Hello everyone, welcome back to the CSFL Kickoff show. Wow, we've got an episode for you today. The entire focus of it is going to be trying to break down the trade deadline action, all of the chaos that has occurred, players, assets, draft picks, all changing hands through the weekend. We will be here to break it down and discuss who winners and losers are and what it means for the league. Okay, so it's good to be back today on an episode after a couple of weeks off, and oh my goodness me, what an episode to come back with. Of course, we're going to be just talking through the sheer volume of trades that have been going on in the CSFL over the past couple of weeks leading up to the trade deadline last weekend. I mean, it's been absolutely manic, and we will try and break this down as best we can. And that does mean that, unfortunately, for this week's episode, we won't be doing any tips or tricks. We're going to just be talking through trades, impact on the league, and giving my views on how that all is going to shape up. Now, there's many ways we can try and tackle this. The best way I can think of doing this is starting from probably week 8 of the regular season, breaking down some of the trades. We'll dive into few different teams because they were more active in terms of the trades, and the shape of the different transactions do have an impact on my overall opinion. So we'll talk about those teams first, and then we'll come back and we will talk about any of the remaining trades that have occurred over the past week or so. And just to give you a flavour for what we're going to be discussing today, I've done a quick tally up of the number of transactions I'm going to be talking about on this show, and we have come to a grand total of 29. So it is going to be quite fast paced. We're going to be talking a lot about different transactions, but let's dive straight into it. Unfortunately, I will give a shout out to the Texas and Dallas trade and the Miami and Giants trade. Unfortunately, they've kind of not missed the cut, and we will obviously talk about all of those teams, probably apart from the Giants, who I don't think made another transaction. But all the others are going to be covered, and we'll probably talk about those retrospectively as we get through. But I mean, just to give you a sense of the sheer activity of the league at this time of the season, this is just from week 8, okay, on the transaction screen. So there's a lot to talk about, a huge amount. I mean, even if we don't talk about the free agency pickups, the amount of trades, look at this. This is just unbelievable. It's just crazy. So I will also say before we dive into this again, I'm not going to be talking about trades where players moved for free in a trade. You know, the ones that are moved by for considerations. We won't talk about those as an individual trade. We'll just talk about probably them if we talk about the teams in general. But let's talk about probably the first team that is probably the most interesting to begin with in terms of the number of transactions completed probably before the trade deadline. It's fair to say they got a few things done in week 8, week 9, and obviously in week 10. But it is, of course, the Arizona Cardinals. I mean, they have been frantically trying to upgrade this roster over the past couple of weeks, and there is a lot of deals to try and break down here. Let's try and talk about it and see what the actual impact is for this team. So, obviously, at the beginning of the season, they did make the huge trade for J.J. Watt, and we did cover that on a previous episode. So it was clear that the direction of travel of the Cardinals was going to be moving from what was a rebuilding team, really, into a team that is going to try and compete and try and get into the playoffs and make some noise once it gets there. And they certainly have made some trades to get that job over the line as best they can. First one we should probably talk about is this move that they did with the Bengals for Julio Jones. Moving to the Cardinals in exchange for Landry, Gilbert, a couple of third-round picks and a second-round pick. And, well, I mean, it's a huge upgrade for them in terms of the talent at the wide receiver position. Julio Jones is probably one of the league's best wide receivers at this moment in time, it's fair to say, just given on the fact that he's got amazing agility, great speed, incredible hands, and he also is on a very, very good contract for his capability. And you can see here, you know, in the games that he's been playing so far this season, he's putting up some fairly decent numbers. I'm sure they're going to be looking to maximise him as best they can. over the coming weeks. But that does mean obviously they got that elite wide receiver in, and they were of course looking for that elite quarterback to kind of tie up to this team. They did look at Robert Griffin III. Unfortunately, they didn't get through the trade committee, as we know. But they did go back searching for some more transactions, and they did manage to pick up Jimmy Garoppolo from the Denver Broncos, who is one of these interesting quarterbacks. I think it's fair to say he's on a decent sized contract for his ability. He has some good stats. His arm, intelligence, accuracy, all good. The main thing that has been the question mark over Jimmy G since he's been in the league really has been his quarterback player skill ability, and whether that is the thing that is holding him back. But it's fair to say that Toasty from the Broncos has been kind of tracking this, and as you can see, he's kind of followed Toasty around a little bit in the league as well. He's started to improve this skill, probably due to the player progression changes that we implemented a season and a bit ago now. So the Cardinals were looking for that youngish quarterback who could lead them for several seasons. They feel they found it in Jimmy Garoppolo, and it's going to be really, really fascinating to see how he combines, in particular with Julio Jones, as the season kind of progresses and goes on. And they've given up a fair bit of asset for him. I mean, Nate Soldier, Keenan Allen, and a first-round pick is certainly something that is not dealt loosely in this league. So they gave up quite a lot to try and get him, but they felt like he was the right type of fit for this team going forward. And then the Cardinals basically continued on this trend in terms of completing various transactions, and basically then decided that there was an opportunity here to try and bring in some different personnel from the Ravens, who are going through a rebuilding phase after really dominating the AFC for a number of years, with the Titans being up there as one of the contending teams. New GM's come in there and has decided he's going to rebuild it. The team's aging, understandable, but it gave a great opportunity here for the Cardinals to pick up some really, really interesting players and to add just that little bit of veteran presence to Jimmy Garoppolo, to Julio Jones, in the likes of Trent Richardson and Antonio Brown. And this is a really, really interesting transaction because, one, I think adding in Brown basically gives Julio Jones a bit more license in terms of his numbers. Antonio Brown is an elite wide receiver, again on the similar type of contract, a little bit older than Julio Jones, but he has been a phenomenal receiving player for many years now, putting out comfortably good numbers throughout every single season he's been in the league, really. So it's going to be interesting to see. They've finally got sort of in my opinion, a really good elite wide receiver 1 and 2 that they can shift around. And they've also got obviously Josh Morgan in there as a wide receiver 3. So they've got 3, I would say, really good elite receiving talents on this team now. And it's going to be fascinating to see how they can utilise that with Jimmy G. Obviously, they also needed to, felt there was an opportunity to pick up Trent Richardson, who in my opinion is still one of the elite running backs in the league. He's still got really good speed. His agility is still pretty good. His strength is still a very, very good position. He's on an increasing contract. For a running back, that's quite an expensive contract in the later part of his years. If he does start to decline around that 32, 33 age that we typically have started to see some players decline. And we can see in the progression, he has started to face a little bit of a decline in terms of his speed drop off over the last training camp. So it might be a more expensive contract through the later part of the years. But for now, I mean, adding him along with the elite receivers they've got, along with Jimmy G, they're in a really, really strong position, I feel now, the Cardinals, to really make that push for the playoffs. And, once they get in there, they've got some talent on both sides of the ball now to really, really make it very hard for a range of different teams in the NFC. And then finally, the Cardinals did obviously pick up Anthony Miller, who I thought was a pretty undervalued pickup, actually. Just a third-round pick. Obviously, Miller is one of these guys who is sort of on a decent declining contract. He's got good hands. He's a good receiving and blocking type of tight end. He can kind of do a bit of both, is what I would class him as. He's not really the elite at either, but he's very good at both. And I feel like just picking him up again, another type of receiving option, another type of blocking option, in a position where they can basically run him and Heath Miller, which is going to be really interesting too. Sort of experienced veteran guys there. So summing up sort of where the Cardinals really are, I feel that they're in that sort of ballpark now where I think they're probably going to be a playoff team this year. And I think they could be a dark horse in the NFC, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. They've got some really, really interesting personnel on this team now, and it's kind of a case of just getting it to mesh together now in the remaining sort of 6 or so games that they've got left. So I'm going to be really excited to see how the Cardinals do. I think it's the right direction of travel for them. They've been rebuilding for a little bit of time now. They had some assets to use. They've kind of utilised them. I would say my only question mark is I'm not a massive Jimmy G fan. I feel like he's not necessarily going to put up the right type of numbers or percentages that this team's probably going to need. And whether they do end up cutting back on that and maybe bringing in another quarterback in a few seasons' time, I don't know. And a lot of this is going to hinder on his ability to use some of those elite tools that he's got around him now. And we'll certainly see how that works over the rest of the season. But that does bring us on to probably talking about another team that was involved in a couple of transactions here with the Cardinals. Let's jump over to the Denver Broncos, who are basically having one of the best seasons they've had in a long time, really. They've always been a contender. They've always been around there. They had a downward season last year. Obviously, Noah, the GM, had moved away. Toasty's come in to take this team on, really changed the direction of travel with this team, and has made some really stark trades so far this season, I would say. First one I would probably begin to start with is this this trade where they gave up the first round pick and a second round pick for Zadarius Smith. Hopefully I've got that name right. I'm sure you guys can correct me if it's not, but they gave up quite a lot for him, and there was a couple of question marks as to why they gave up a lot for this type of player. But let's try and break it down why I think they've gone for this approach. So obviously they gave up JJ Watt at the beginning of the off season, going into the regular season. But Zadarius Smith is one of these elite linebackers of a good age who has been, making some development gains over the past, probably past couple of seasons. I would say he didn't make much last season, but past couple of seasons, a couple of bumps. He's already got really good all-round ability. His strength, agility, tackling, speed are all in the ballpark of what you'd expect for being a very good linebacker. And given that he is 25, he's got 3 years left on basically his rookie contract. Good couple of years there. It was worth them in terms of dealing up the asset to try and bring in someone who is an elite linebacker to really support the guys like Barr and Guyton in here. And I feel like they're probably leaning towards Guyton is probably obviously going to leave in the off season. So they'll run with Barr and Smith, and they probably felt there was a hole there for longer term for this team to be, contending as it is now, and that's why they probably felt they had to move some sizable assets really to try and bring him in. And to be perfectly honest with you, with the picks they gave up, they're not going to be in the ballpark range for bringing in someone like Smith in the draft anyway. So that was kind of, I think, their thinking behind it. They obviously then did at the same time flip Jimmy G to the Cardinals to pick up, their first round pick. Nate Soldier and Allen are obviously fairly good players still. We could talk about those as well. So they obviously probably did that on the back of knowing they were going to be getting a first round pick back anyway. And, picking up Soldier, who's expiring, but a good tackle, is a good pick up at this moment in time, along with a first round pick. So, Keenan Allen is probably going to be a serviceable receiver for them. He's on a good contract. So they basically probably positioned it in the sense of, well, we're giving up a lot to get Smith in, but we're also receiving quite a lot back for the Cardinals trade. So it makes sense when you compare the two together, in my opinion. So then we move on to probably talking a little bit about the first blockbuster trade that they really did, and that was with the Lions to bring in the likes of Megatron, Calvin Johnson, in exchange for a second round pick, Thomas and Parker. So second and third round pick it was in exchange. So let's talk a little bit about that. So they obviously moved Jimmy G, brought in a linebacker, obviously had the hole at quarterback. There was some discussions to whether they were going to run with the sixth round pick quarterback that they received through the draft. He performed fairly well for them. That Kirk Cousins is clearly not favourable in this team. Toasty is clearly not a Kirk Cousins fan. He's been trying to move him left, right, and centre, so he was never going to start for them. But they decided they were going to bring in an elite wide receiver first of all, and they obviously gave up a fair bit in terms of assets. Gave up a young wide receiver who probably doesn't have the positional skill that Toasty wanted. He's just been discussing that for a long time, that he's more leaning towards guys with high position skill and ratings versus low position skill and possible potential to develop there. He wanted guys who are ready now, and it makes perfect sense for this Denver Broncos side, who are unbeaten, having a phenomenal season. Their chances of them, bringing in that title are certainly really, really up there this year. There's no denying that. So picking up Johnson on an expiring contract, who is the league's best wide receiver, hands down, at this moment in time, it makes sense. Particularly at that moment in time where they were probably looking at leaning on a younger quarterback. You do need elite talent in the receiving clause to kind of compensate for that. So it did make sense. But they then went and obviously then completed the transaction for Ben Roethlisberger, who we've talked about a lot, who basically was picked up by Miami in free agency. Really didn't fit well with that Miami team. We'll talk about the Dolphins a little bit later on. But it was an opportunity for the Broncos. They flipped Jimmy G, got some assets back. They've brought in Megatron, an elite veteran wide receiver, to then bring in probably one of the league's top 10 quarterbacks on a pretty decent transaction. Was certainly something that basically puts this Broncos team over the top. I mean, they are contenders anyway. They are going to be even more at contender status now that they've just brought in, Roethlisberger on his short-term contract to see whether they can win the championship. And for me, I really like that transaction. I thought that was just the right move for this Broncos team. They gave up, obviously, the Cardinals' first-round pick that they did get from Jimmy G, so they obviously flipped some assets back there. But, basically they've upgraded their quarterback position, upgraded their wide receiver position, and upgraded their linebacker position off the back of a Jimmy G trade and some assets they already had. So, phenomenal bit of business there, I think, by Toasty to try and do that. They then obviously tried to basically strengthen up some of this contending status. Brought in Dunlap from the Broncos for a fifth. Then obviously decided to bring in Brandon Marshall and Jason Verrett from the from the Panthers in exchange for some picks and some player movement there. We could talk about Marshall. Basically, I can understand the reasoning for that. They obviously have got Megatron in here, but you also do need another elite wide receiver. And, bringing in Brandon Marshall, who is still a phenomenal receiver in this league, despite it being 35 years old. This team is in really, really good shape now to be basically one of the top two teams in the league, and showing by their record, showing by their performance so far. And I think it's going to be very, very hard to beat this Denver side at this moment in time. I think, we're going to see teams really, really, really struggle a little bit against them. They've just got some elite talent they brought in, and for an unbeaten team that's already performing exceptionally well on both sides of the ball, who knows? Could be a championship year for Denver as well, I would say, from them so far. But obviously on the other side of that, particularly of the Ben Roethlisberger transaction, was the Miami Dolphins, who have also been incredibly active during this trade deadline period. Now, we could talk about the Jake Long deal. I don't want to talk too much about it, but I thought that was a good transaction. They managed to basically, bring in a couple of decent options there in terms of giving away a couple of picks, and on the face of it, looks like it's the right direction. I would say with Miami, talking about some of their transactions, sometimes it's unclear whether this team is really contending or really sort of retooling, and you'll kind of see the flavour for that when we talk about some of the trades they did at the deadline as to why I'm kind of uncertain where the Dolphins are going to go this year, whether they're going to be pushing for the division title, whether they're going to basically drop back in and maybe possibly be a borderline wildcard team. It's just really, really hard to tell. But obviously, we can talk about the Ben Roethlisberger transaction first. I thought, it was the right move for Miami, is what I would say. In retrospective view, they weren't going to be playing Ben Roethlisberger. He wasn't the right fit for them. he wasn't functioning as they intended for him. They've essentially gone back to a mix of guys in terms of the quarterback position. So Glennon's been playing, Lindley's been playing. They're kind of just going to rotate that quarterback position. Ben Roethlisberger, for whatever reason, was not the right fit. So it made sense for them to basically trade him, his maximum value, to a team that was really, really looking for that elite quarterback to put them completely over the top this year. So, acquiring some first round pick for him, this certainly was the right move in the end. They obviously then continued to move with the transactions and moved Trufant as well. So another elite option, a cornerback, was moved by the Dolphins for another first round pick. So collection of assets here. When I saw these trades sort of come in, I kind of thought, okay, the Miami are going to go for a bit of a rebuilding here. They're going to start to basically wind back some of the talent they've got, retool and re-go next year with even more young talent on the team, hopefully. But then they completed a transaction with the Bengals, which was an interesting one because it kind of looked like they were kind of acquiring some more elite older talent, which I thought was peculiar. And it kind of made me think, okay, maybe the Dolphins are not necessarily rebuilding. They may be retweaking to see if they can have a go at the division, but just looking at what they can basically move around to maximise their assets they'll have for the future. And that was very much in terms of the thinking, I think, for this deal, to basically move Reef, Rowe, Zach, some 4th, 5th and 3rd round picks for Wagner, Collins and Claiborne. So let's talk a little bit about this one. In terms of the Claiborne pickup, I thought it was really, really good pickup. I mean, the guy's 27 years old. He's on a good contract. He's, one of the best defensive ends in a position that's, a position of need across the league, really. It's very hard to find the elite ones. And if you can find good ones that fit, it's always a good idea. Picking up Wagner, it was a nice pickup, I felt. Couple of years on his contract, good age, can see how he looks and then maybe look at him a little bit more going forward. So it kind of made sense in terms of they picked up some, what I would call like some middling 20, I would call them veterans really, some of them, because they've been around the league for a little while now. And then obviously, basically doing that to essentially pick up some guys I thought that the Dolphins can see helping them now because they've got some neat positional needs there, but also helping them next year and maybe the year after. So and having a little look at them this year, seeing if they fit, maybe flipping them in the off-season is kind of where I see it going. But you can see on the shape of it, they've moved a couple of veterans, picked up some first-round picks, then kind of looked for value in the market is what I'd call the Dolphins have been doing. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether this team is really, whether the table's really turned and they're really, really going for it this season, or whether they're just winding back a little bit. And I'd be interested to see how they do over the next couple of games or so. And that'll probably give us a bit more of an indication of where this team is kind of heading this season. But finishing the trade deadline, they're 6-3. They've gained some assets, got some players who probably can help them now and in the future. Overall, kind of makes sense in terms of that. But they've got some really, really interesting games coming up. And the Jags, the Bills, the Bears, the Lions, and Vikings, so they've all got to play all of those guys before the rest of the season finishes. So they could wind it back and probably not be competing for the division based on that schedule. That's what I've got to say on sort of the Dolphins, really. I think that we'll see is what I would say for them. That'd be my sort of one-liner for the Dolphins. We'll have to wait and see and how it turns out for them. But there's some other teams we've got to talk about who are very active at the trade deadline. Another team that probably is an interesting one to kind of discuss because of direction of travel is probably the Carolina Panthers, who, as we all know, Kyrus, the GM of the Panthers, is always incredibly active at trades through the season. This is the gentleman who basically broke the league HTML and the game HTML because he had too many trades in one season, and the line of trades basically ran out, and it basically cleared it because he traded too much. So it's no surprise that he's been incredibly active throughout the trade deadline period. And we talked about the Miller trade earlier. made sense for the Cardinals. They're 5-4. They're probably that borderline team that may end up in the wildcard slot, may end up in the playoff position if they win the division. But, making the sense of moving the veteran guy for a third round pick, which we know Kairos has been stashing for a long time, those sort of picks anyway, and turning them into assets in the future makes sense for them. They then obviously made a couple of other transactions, picking up Gabe Icard. Interesting one, I think. Basically, turning a third round pick into him, and let's see if we can work out what the reasoning is for that pickup. Let's just try and find him on here. One thing I would say about the game, it's really annoying you can't just click into players here. It would make life a little bit easier. Let's see if we can find him, unless he's been released. That would make sense. There he is. So centre Gabe Icard. So he's on expiring. I'm guessing it's more a fit to see whether he will function in this team going forward. Got good strength, good running blocking ability. He's only 28, so he's got a few years left at this moment in time. Maybe they're seeing something that they can maybe turn this into a longer term, cheaper contract, and it'd be a nice O-line sort of piece for them going forward as sort of a cheap depth piece. Maybe that's probably a thinking there. So, hang on, let's get rid of that. 1 second. Let's try and clear that so that we don't just see him up on the screen. So the first couple of moves, kind of just like typical Panthers moves, I would call, moving some guys around, looking at maximum value. They then obviously completed the Brandon Marshall pickup, obviously to the Broncos, who are, as we said, are contending. Basically trying to stash a second round pick. A couple of interesting guys kind of moved on here. I think it's more just in case of they were looking to move Marshall anyway. He was expiring. He was getting older. He was never going to be part of this team longer term. And again, when you're 5-4, you're kind of looking at some of these veteran guys that you've got and whether you want to stick them around and really utilise them for their last season or so probably with you, or whether you want to just basically trade and stash them to get an asset. And that's essentially what they've done with that transaction. But the interesting trade of the Carolina Panthers is certainly the trade they made for Robert Griffin III. And you can see just by the sheer number of stuff and picks in this transaction, it's a bit of a mess to try and break down. So they basically, you can ignore pretty much every player that's moved in this apart from Robert Griffin III because they're not that valuable. So they've essentially moved a couple of second round picks, a couple of fifth round picks, a fourth, a sixth, and a couple of seconds for Robert Griffin III. So this is the team that obviously traded Cam Newton to Dallas last year for a couple of first round pick, I believe, and some other bits and pieces. But they've had Chase Daniel for a little while now this season. Picked him up. He's obviously on a really nice contract for them going forward longer term. He's only going to be paid $3.9 million next year. So he's probably going to be a nice one to fit into that backup quarterback role next year. But for whatever reason, the Panthers didn't feel that he was the right fit for them this year. And, given that they're 5-4, probably understandable that they were looking a little bit around the quarterback market. They obviously had Chad Henne as well, who's played a couple of games, not really done it for them either. So we know that the Jets are in a rebuilding period after their Super Bowl final appearance last year. GM change, a lot of the players and were basically left into free agency by this team. So they were obviously looking to try and gain some assets whatever way they can to completely rebuild that roster, which meant that Robert Griffin III was involved in a huge amount of trade discussion. The main thing that we can say about Robert Griffin III is that on paper, he is a phenomenal quarterback. Some GMs have really struggled with him. As you can see here, his time in Jacksonville was not particularly the best. His one season in New York, really, last year was phenomenal. So he's shown that with the right strategy, he can be one of the best quarterbacks in the league. There's no denying that. So for the Panthers to come along, move some seconds, fourths, fifths, sevenths, and basically a stream of players who are not valuable, to take a chance on a guy who's got maybe a season and a half left of his contract, it makes perfect sense for the Panthers, who are looking for that type of quarterback. And it makes sense for the Jets, I will say, to basically try and cash him in for whatever way they can, because as soon as it comes down to an expiring contract, that value is going to drop off anyway. And he'll be 31, and there'll be question marks as to whether he will be able to survive the next contract, really. So, makes sense for the Panthers to basically pick him up. What does this mean for the Panthers going forward? It's really hard to tell. He's a similar type of quarterback to Cam Newton. So if there's any place that he could land where he is going to be back to his best from last season, it will be in Carolina. And whether this is the spur for this season that gets the Panthers back into sort of basically dominating their division, or whether it's next season, we'll wait and see. But I think this was a great value pickup for the Panthers. And also I think the Jets probably got the right type of deal that they could have got for Robert Griffin III at the trade deadline. So it made sense from both teams' perspective, I think. We will see how that pans out for the Panthers. The Jets obviously was rebuilding, so a couple of picks next year. We'll see what they draft with that. But that kind of moves us on to another team that's sniffing around in the NFC, in particular in the Carolina Panthers division. And that is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have also been incredibly active at the trade deadline. And let's try and break down a couple of their transactions. So the first one I think is probably worth talking about is, let's talk a little bit about the Jonathan Anderson and Dion Bailey and third round pick to the Jets for Jamie Collins. So the Jamie Collins, let's talk about him. So they've obviously moved quite a lot to try and pick this guy up from the Jets in terms of just a range of different assets. Let's try and find him. So again, similar to the Broncos, I would say, they've targeted a similar type of linebacker. Someone who can do a bit of everything. He's got speed, he's got hands, he's got tackling, agility, strength is all there. Cheap contract for the next couple of years. Basically a similar type of deal. He's not as good as Smith on the Broncos, but he's still a very, very good starting linebacker. And again, it's probably a cost-saving mechanism tied in with the bit of progression that we've seen from him over the past training camp or so. So it makes sense for them. The Buccaneers are in this weird position where they're 4-5, and this season they were really expecting to turn the dial and really be a contending team. And given the Rodgers injury early on and past couple of games when Rodgers come back, it's been a mixed bag. I would say after the bye week, they've won 2, lost 2, kind of still trying to play a bit of catch up. And some of their trades reflect some of this trying to catch up, trying to get talent in, trying to really compete this season. So the next deal they obviously did was move some various players around for some picks, basically trying to clear some cap space in order to acquire Jonathan Cooper from the Detroit Lions. And the reason why I think they moved for Cooper was a couple of things. Probably because, well, number one, Cooper is probably an elite guard. They've got Pouncey, who is already there, but they needed another guy to put next to him to really give Rodgers that kind of defensive shape that he needs. So they've got 2 elite tackles now. They've got the elite centre, and now they've got 2 elite guards. So they've got the O-line in place now for Rodgers to really maximise his capability. And I think that the main reason they did that is because O-line is very difficult in the league in general to find elite guys at decent price values. And given that Jonathan Cooper is expiring, and they can probably try and lock him up into a deal, around the 9 to sort of £10 million range, $1 million range, I would imagine. He makes sense for them to try and cash in now. He'll help them immediately. He's not got to develop. He can be extended, hopefully, for them. And it means that basically they've got the right guys around Rodgers to really, really try and get back from this 4-5 record and really get themselves back into division contending status really this year. So it made sense for them. They've got a schedule that's pretty favourable, I would say. Cowboys will be a tough game. So will the Broncos and Cardinals, and probably the Saints game, who have resurgent in their form this year. But they've got some winnable games. The Raiders, the Chiefs, the Falcons, all winnable games. They could end up 9-7 possibly if they can really, really keep up this performance and get themselves back into that division contending status. So I think the trades that they've made at the deadline made sense for them. They've moved some assets in the future, but they've really got to try and compete now and try and really maximise the usage of Rodgers, who they did trade up an awful lot to acquire in the off season. So that's the Bucs. Let's head back over to the AFC and talk about a team that was also incredibly active at the trade deadline and talk about some of their trades altogether. So the first one is obviously we're going to be talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers, who completed a whole host of transactions. First one was obviously to move Tannehill to the Lions for a fourth. The Lions, obviously, with Stafford injured until probably the postseason, needed to bring in a quarterback, basically to back up Delvin or to compete with Delvin for that position. We know Tannehill has been at the Lions previously and has performed to a good standard there, so it made sense for the Lions' perspective to pick him up. But also the Steelers cashing in on a guy who was probably not going to play for them made sense from that perspective. But then we can talk about some of the major transactions of this Steelers team. First one, obviously, was to pick up Amari Cooper from the 49ers for a first-round pick and Sukai and Gordon, who are, I would say, starter-level players, but on expiring or near expiring contracts. But the real asset that they picked up is the real thing to talk about. Getting Amari Cooper for what is a late first-round pick and a couple of players who probably won't be on the 49ers for much longer is an absolute steal. Amari Cooper is one of the best young wide receivers in the league. He's on his rookie deal for 3 more seasons, 2.5 now, and he is just a phenomenal player. So his speed, hands, agility are all elite already. Intelligence could come up a bit. His receiving position skill is already at a good level. So he is already probably one of the better, number one wide receivers in the league, and he's only 23. So for the Steelers to pick him up for a pick that's going to be low, given that they're 9-1, and even if they lose every game now, they still would be a mid-range pick, is an absolute steal. I would say I'm not sure from the perspective of the 49ers why they would have given up Amari Cooper for this sort of price tag. The team basically has a huge amount of cap going into the offseason. There was no real massive need to move him at this moment in time. They could have probably packaged him with something in the offseason if they really felt there was someone in the draft they could have moved up for example. But, Steelers managed to acquire him, and I think he's going to be a phenomenal piece for them. It gives them cost saving at one of the elite positions, and a guy for the next couple of years who's going to be phenomenal for them. So that makes sense. The Steelers obviously then basically moved Lee and a 5th round pick to pick up Giovanni Bernard. Bernard is an interesting player in the perspective that he's a very, very good running back. He's probably not a starting running back in terms of just looking at general ability across the league, but he is one of these guys who's got speed, he's got agility, strength. He is developing really, really well as well, which is what you'll see here. And he is probably going to become an elite running back in this league over the next couple of years. He's only 24, remember. He is expiring, so the Steelers will probably seek to try and lock him down a good contract, but it gives them a nice balance with Mostert, who probably doesn't have the strength of Bernard. So they can run different types of sets through Bernard, and that's going to really help them in terms of their offensive game. And I can see why they made that move. From the Bengals' perspective, cashing in him for a 5th round pick and Lee, maybe a little bit lower in terms of value, but the general running back value market is lower than most. So they had to cash in what they could. They didn't feel that he was probably going to be a longer term fit for them. They probably didn't want to pay him. So Bengals lost is the Steelers game in that perspective. So the Steelers then obviously went into stayed in the AFC, went back over to the Patriots to pick up Zach Martin and Denarian Thomas in exchange for a 5th and a 6th. So let's talk a little bit about these two guys they picked up. So it was a low value pickup from the perspective of really what was given up. But they managed to pick up a really, really good young guard who's got strength, got blocking ability, again, he's locked down to a decent contract for next year, so really, really good pickup there. And then also Thomas, who probably is not the starting safety for this team, but cheap contract, young, also, probably not necessarily got to his development gains yet, but has shown some sign of development. Going to be probably a good depth piece for this Steelers team. I would probably say that the Martin pickup in that deal was really, really good value for them. They then jumped over to the Chargers and picked up Raji, who is a really, really good defensive tackle. Third round pick's probably about the right value for him. But what does this mean in terms of all the transactions the Steelers have completed? Well, they're 9-1. They've been absolutely flying this season. McCoy has been sensational. Everything's been working really, really well for the Steelers team. They're effective on both sides of the ball. There's no denying that they're going to be a playoff team. They're going to probably be a contending team. But they need to win their division. That's the key thing for the Steelers. And they are facing some stiff competition from the Browns this year. So they obviously felt they had to make several moves to try and tie in some depth pieces, get some additional players to put them over the top, not this year, but also next year as well. And I think they've probably done that in this free agent in this trade deadline period. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how they do over the remaining course of the season. They've got a pretty nice schedule, but week 17 is going to be the interesting one. Both teams could still be neck and neck in terms of win-loss ratio, and we'll see how that plays out. But the Steelers certainly have really come in this year. The new GM has come in and really put his stamp on the CSFL and his stamp on this team. And probably be talking about him for probably GM of the year, Coach of the year, I'd imagine. So fantastic work by the Steelers. Really interesting trade deadline from their perspective. So that brings us to a close of probably the team retrospectives that I wanted to talk about. But there are a whole host of other transactions that we do need to try and break down, and we do need to talk a little bit about. So let's try and work our way through some of those and bring ourselves to a conclusion for this episode. The first one that I probably will want to try and talk a little bit about is let's head over to the Chargers. Let's start with the Chargers. So the Chargers are an interesting conundrum this year. They're 4-6. They have had some phenomenal seasons really with Jared Goff to date, but for whatever reason it hasn't quite worked out for them this year. So they've completed a whole host of transactions really to try and pull themselves into a bit of a retooling phase, is what I would say. So we talked a little bit about some of the deals they did with the Broncos. Talked about the deal with the Steelers. They also moved Felix Jones, who is an elite running back, to the Lions for a third-round pick. Similar type of transaction to Bernard and the Steelers. It makes sense from the Chargers' perspective if they don't feel they're necessarily going to be able to get back from that 4-6 record they're in. The Lions obviously needed some insurance for Henry, so made sense. They then also moved Louis Vasquez to the Cowboys, which I feel is a fantastic pickup for the Cowboys. They've managed to get themselves an elite offensive lineman there for a 4th-round pick. Again, expiring, I think, but makes sense. They're cashing in, picking up some of these mid-round picks that they'll need to retool in the off-season. So the Chargers, I think, are probably going to drop away a little bit more this season. I don't think they're going to come back and probably be in playoff contention, but I think makes sense for them given where they are. Let's move over. Let's stay in the AFC because the AFC was incredibly active. Let's talk a little bit about the Patriots, and let's talk a little bit about some of the rebuilding that they've got going on. So we have discussed the Steelers transaction, but we haven't discussed probably the biggest transaction that was completed for them. They have decided to move Rob Gronkowski to the Titans for a 1st-round pick, Wright, Johnson and Thomas, which is really, really interesting. So we know that the Patriots were originally run by Rizzo, our original commissioner of the league, who stepped away at the beginning of the season. New GM has come in and decided that this team is going to basically rebuild. And the way they're going to do that is they're obviously going to move some of the older veterans that they've got for some of the some various different assets, and they made no bones about it that that's what they're going to be doing between now and probably in the off season as well. But they have moved Ron Gronkowski for a first round pick to the Titans, which is probably going to be anywhere, to be perfectly honest with you. This Buccaneers team we've talked about probably will be competing for the division. It's probably not going to be a bottom 5 pick. If anything, it's going to be a mid to late pick for Rob Gronkowski. So I feel like it was a bit of a misstep in my opinion. I feel, tight end is a position that is in huge need across the league. I felt that they probably could have got a little bit more if they'd have maybe sat on him even till the off season. But on reflection, they were looking to try and make a move, get some assets in ready for the off season. So they decided that Gronkowski was the one that needed to move. But it does mean that the Titans, who are in a bit of a slugfest really in the AFC this year, the Broncos are flying. They're team that's basically been retooled in the off season, have managed to pick up an elite wide receiver, an elite tight end in Gronkowski, and he's on a nice declining contract. I think that probably is the move that puts the Titans in over the top in terms of their roster design this year. I don't know whether they've got enough to beat the Broncos. That will be a fascinating game if they do play each other in the playoffs. But at 9-1, they've got to basically outdo the Steelers, outdo the Browns, outdo the Broncos to try and get that home bye. Whether they've got enough here to do it, I don't know. But that Gronkowski move was really, really good from their perspective. New England, I think it's really going to come down to who they managed to pick up with that draft pick. I mean, Wright is he's an okay wide receiver 3. He's nothing really that special. I think Cam Johnson's probably the value pickup in the deal, but again, he's a good defensive end in a position of need. He's on a good contract, but I don't think he's ever going to be an elite defensive end, is what I would say. So we'll see how that one pans out for the Patriots. I think on reflection now, the Titans probably won that trade, but we'll see further down the line how that one works out. So that brings us to talking a little bit about let's head over to talk a bit about the Bengals, who have also been very active. A team that's basically rebuilding. There's no denying that. We talked about the Julio Jones trade, talked about the Lee trade. We talked about everything they kind of have really done here. I think it's worth saying that my overall reflection is that they've managed to cash in a various amount of guys. This team is going to be looking at the off-season, looking at who they can draft, who they can pick up. I think that's as much as we can say. I mean, I don't know whether Matt Ryan will stay around this team. They're trying to extend him, I understand, but it'd be nice if they could lock him down to a decent contract, just given that they will be able to secure that quarterback position. But the Bengals rebuilding, not much else really to say on that one. And then we can talk a little bit about the see if we checked everything. So we probably haven't talked a bit about one other transaction that occurred, and that was the Bears making a deal with the Browns. Let's try and find out. Let's see if we can find that. Here we go. So they moved a 5th round pick for Armstead, who, I mean, again, it's a bit of shuffling around in retrospect. He's a okay guard. I think it's more just a depth piece basically to fill a void for them this year. But 7-3, Bears are basically standing pat, seeing whether they've got enough to get themselves into the wild card position this year. And then I think we've talked about every transaction now, but there's probably 2 other teams that we should probably just quickly mention, and that is the Cleveland Browns, who are 9-1, making not that many trades, pretty much standing pat. Looking at an interesting trade for Webb for a 1st round pick. Let's just talk a little bit about that one. So they brought in a tackle who is probably not an elite tackle, and I don't think he ever will be an elite tackle. His development gains have been okay to date, but given that he's 28 years old, he's on a sizable contract for his ability, in my opinion. I feel that was a little bit overpriced, but their reasoning was that he was basically a good age. He's not going to decline during this length of this contract, but they're going to be paying him an awful lot for next year. But given that they're 9-1, they did have a need at tackle. It'd be interesting to see how he fits for them. Given the Steelers have also made a huge amount of transactions, it's really a bit of an arms race in that division review this year. And finally, let's talk a little bit about Dallas. Dallas, we talked about Vasquez being picked up. They've made a couple of moves. I think they're very much in a contending status team at this moment in time. The moves they have made have been basically either cashing in guys that they felt they didn't necessarily need, but bringing in the likes of Gilchrist and the likes of Vasquez, I think, are going to be huge pickups for them. They're pretty much in the lead of their division now. The schedule's not looking too bad for them. I mean, they've got to play the Steelers, Browns, and the Bucks, is what I would say are the tough ones. Bears and no pushovers either. But I feel they're in the driving seat now. 8-1. They're probably going to be a playoff team. It's really about getting guys who can put them over the top. And I feel that they felt Gilchrist, who's going to obviously beef up that cornerback position for them, is really going to be a good help. And, the likes of Vasquez. So that kind of brings us to a conclusion of all of the trades, I think, that have been completed over this trade deadline since week 8. And wow, there's just a lot. There was a lot to try and break down. I think the fascinating thing is that a lot of the trades have been made between teams that are competing and teams that are trying to rebuild, people trying to cash in guys, move guys around, and that's a natural thing that generally occurs. But I have to say, it's been fascinating to just follow along. Hopefully this has given a bit of a reflection as to some of the main moves, some of the big moves across the league. Interested to hear what your thoughts are, of course, with the various trades and transactions that were completed. But I think it's been complete and fun chaos, I would say. Really felt reflective of a true trade deadline with guys moving veterans, moving pieces, moving assets. And I'm sure it will continue next season when we get to the trade deadline. We had, as I said, we had about 29 transactions that I just talked about here. There was also a whole host completed in week 7. There was also moves of guys for free, basically, to try and move cap around. And it's been fascinating to watch. I mean, I think we counted up a grand total of 13 or 14 transactions completed on deadline, in the deadline 48 hours before as well, which is absolutely insane. So it's great to see that there's that level of activity. I'm sure that will return when we talk about the draft and we get to that point of the off-season. But for now, that gives us a bit of a reflection at week 10, heading into week 11. Obviously, no more trades can be completed. I'm sure that Asima will be glad that is completed now. But it's going to be really interesting to see how some of these guys perform for the teams, whether they can be the piece that puts them over the top to win a title, the piece that gives them just enough to get themselves into the playoffs and then anything can happen, or just the right level of assets received to help their team rebuild and retool going into next season. It's been fascinating to try and break that down with you guys. Interested to hear your comments, feedback, views, but let's close up there for the trades that have been completed and head ourselves over to the CSFL GM Bite. Now, it's been a couple of weeks since you guys have heard the previous one. We'll have a little reminder now as to who it was, but we'll then come back and announce who it was.
You are listening to the GM Bite on the CSFL Kickoff show.
Okay, there was your reminder from the previous CSFL GM Bite. Of course, it was none other than our very own Pittsburgh Steelers GM, mhow84. Thank you very much for doing the CSFL GM Bite. That was a tough one, I think, but you had a couple of weeks to look at it and review it. Let's find out who this week's CSFL GM Bite is.
You are listening to the GM Bite on the CSFL Kickoff Show.
Okay, there you go. That was this week's CSFL GM Bite. Get your guesses into the Discord server or onto the channel here itself. And interested to hear who you think it is. But that brings us to a close for this week's episode. Thank you very much for joining and breaking down some of those trade deadline transactions, the chaos that occurred. But now, trades have ended. We are fully focused on the regular season as we move towards the crunch time of it to see who can make the playoffs, who can make the wildcard entries, and of course, who is going to be entering our draft over the coming weeks. That and more will be coming on future episodes. But as always, guys, have a great weekend and we'll be back next week.